Hi, welcome back to Intro to Biology for Majors, or BIOL 1224. This is going to be the Chapter 18 PowerPoint, which is in Module 4 of this course, and this is from the Openstax book, Biology 2E. Chapter 18 is over evolution and the origin of species. So I'd like to start off with our objectives for this chapter, so the things I'd like you to learn and take away. So number 1 would be to define evolution, selective pressure, and natural selection. Number 2 is to recognize common misconceptions about evolution. And number 3 is to identify factors impacting speciation. So now let's talk definitions. So evolution is a change in allele frequency within a population. Broadly speaking, evolution is a change in genetic makeup and often the heritable features or the features that are passed down of a population over time. Changes in DNA involves allele frequency. So these are genetic changes. These occur in populations as a whole, not in specific individuals. And the process of adaptation through different mutations, which allows more desirable traits to be passed down to the next generation, is another way to define evolution. So once again, that's the process of adapting through different mutations within our genes that allows more desirable traits, so traits that are better for survival, to be passed down to new generations. And once again, evolution occurs at the population level. It occurs in populations, not individuals. Some populations, like those of microbes and some insects, actually evolve over a relatively short period of time and can be observed directly. Other populations, though, most of our large mammals and things like that take a long time, so they won't be directly observed. So when we speak about evolution, we have to bring up Charles Darwin. So let's talk about his voyage. So Charles Darwin took the ship called the HMS Beagle and sailed around the world in the 1830s. While he was doing that, he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So the process of natural selection does not favor traits that are somehow superior, so that are inherently superior. They don't favor the better traits. Instead, it favors traits that are more beneficial. That is, they help an organism survive and reproduce more effectively than its peers, than other organisms within the population. In a specific environment, traits that are helpful in one environment might actually be harmful in another. So natural selection requires a population over time exhibiting traits determined by different alleles within their DNA. Organisms with heritable or basically genetically determined traits that are passed down from parents, with those features, they help them survive and reproduce in a particular environment, and they tend to leave more offspring than their peers. So if they're leaving more offspring, and if it continues over generations, those heritable features that were positive in the past that aid the survival and reproduction of that species will become more and more common in the population as a whole. Once again, natural selection operates on the variation present in the population. So since more individuals are born than resources can actually support, the struggle to survive is inevitable. Some individuals in a population are better than others at surviving and reproducing. So over generations, those positive traits or the traits that are selected through natural selection to help these individuals survive within their population are inherited, and they continue to move down the line of new generations, and that's the process of natural selection. So now let's talk about how Charles Darwin really found out and defined natural selection in his book, The Origin of Species. So Charles Darwin actually traveled to the Galapagos Islands in the 1800s, and he studied Galapagos finches, so birds. He described 14 distinct types of finches on that island, and each of those were different from birds on the mainland. So we're talking about an island off the coast that actually ended up being so far away from the coast over years and years that these birds did not migrate back and forth to the main coast. They traveled to this island, and they ended up being stuck within that island and that environment. And so they were different from the mainland birds, but they actually shared very similar features in a lot of ways. And he wrote about these finches and selective pressure. So if you look at this image I attached here, we have an ancestral finch that would have come from the mainland, and then we have different food sources. So we have plants, insects, seeds, cactus, and other insects over here. Basically, whenever we spoke in the last slide about the need for survival and that there aren't enough food sources to go around, basically for all of these finches to survive eating the same thing. These finches on the island that no longer could travel back and forth had to evolve different beak shapes in order to survive. So they had to evolve some beak shapes that were good for eating plants, some others that were better for eating insects. Some of them actually even evolved to use tools. Some of them just ate seeds, so they have different types of beaks in order to break those seeds open. Some were able to eat cactuses, and then others ate different types of insects without the use of tools. So this was the way that Charles Darwin really described evolution. This was a really interesting and still is a very interesting concept, that this island is sort of its own environment away from the mainland that you can really study evolution over time. So we have that ancestral type of finch from the mainland that still exists on the mainland. And then from that ancestral finch, 14 different types of finches evolved in order to eat different types of food on the island so that they could survive. So now I'd like to talk about a couple different types of traits in the process of evolution. So I want to talk about convergent traits and divergent traits. So on this side of the slide here, on this side of the line, we're going to have examples of convergent traits. And then on this side, we're going to have examples of divergent traits. So convergent examples are similar traits that happen in multiple species. They appear in similar environments. There's no common ancestor, but there's similar selective pressure because of their environment. So there's similar traits that happen in multiple different species. So here's an example that'll kind of explain what I'm talking about. We have a shark here that's a fish. The shark actually has a fin with very similar bone structure to that of a penguin, which is a bird, who has a wing with very similar bone structure to a dolphin, which is a mammal, that has a flipper with very similar bone structure. So all of their environments would be very similar. They are all, the bird obviously lives on both land and water, but they all have a water environment, so they have very similar selective pressure to evolve. So these convergent examples, these convergent traits come from a very similar process, and they appear in similar environments, but they aren't the exact same species, and there's no ancestor that links all three of these species. They just have very similar traits because their environment led them to evolve this way. So now let's talk about divergent examples. So diverse traits in multiple species from one common ancestor. Marsupials in Australia reflect something called isolation convergence, because once again, Australia is an island where these animals have been isolated, these organisms have been isolated. And then distant relationships to ancestor species. So basically, convergent examples have no common ancestor. Divergent examples do have a common ancestor. So here's a couple different examples to kind of show you. So if we talk about a dog, in example one, a dog species descended directly from a wolf, and we have hundreds, if not thousands, of different species or breeds now of dogs. So that's a divergent trait. They all came from the same common ancestor, but now today, over the process of evolution and selective pressure from humans actually breeding them, we were able to, create this very vast, diverse trait link back to the wolf. So they all have diverse traits in multiple different species, but they have a common ancestor. Same thing here with example 2, we have zebras, donkeys, and horses. They're all actually related to the same common ancestor, but they all have very extremely different phenotypic or physicalities to them. So they're diverse in traits, but they have a similar ancestor. So once again, convergent examples, no similar ancestor, but similar traits because of their environment. Divergent examples, similar ancestor, they do have that common ancestor, and they have multiple traits. So one of the divergent examples also includes vestigial structures, like the tailbone of human and the hind leg bones of whales. So if you haven't heard about that, you should actually look up an image. A lot of students find that really interesting, that whales have evolved from animals that were on land, and now they are mammals that live in the water solely. And they do have vestigial leg bones, which means they have leg bones that are no longer used. So that's a vestigial structure, would be something that is still physically found within the body that's no longer used. Also, humans have a tailbone. Obviously, we don't have tails, so that's called a vestigial structure as well, and that's considered a divergent example. Okay, so in the last slide, we talked about humans applying selective pressure to dog breeds, and I kind of want to dig into that a little bit more. So yeah, humans have the possibility of providing selective pressure. So in this case, we have a common gray wolf, which is the ancestor for all of the dog breeds that we currently have on the planet today. And this happened because humans put selective pressure, or what we call artificial selection, on this gray wolf species. So basically, artificial selection or selective breeding is an example of natural selection. In artificial selection, a human will choose desirable features of an organism, and then they allow only the individuals that it best express those qualities to reproduce in order to be sure that those qualities are produced in the next generation. So this, again, is a divergent action. It's a divergent trait that's passed down, and it accounts for all of the breeds of dogs that we have. So basically, a human decided that they liked small gray wolves or large gray wolves. They would only breed the small or the large together in order to create different sizes, different textures within their fur, different physical and personality traits. So basically, that's the whole reason that we have all these breeds of dogs. What did happen because of human intervention, and that was a process called artificial selection or selective pressure. So now let's talk about the most important part of evolution, surviving to reproduce. So in natural selection, environmental factors cause the differential reproductive success of individuals with particular genotypes. So breaking that down from the complicated version, factors within the environment like temperature, height of, in this example, the trees that the animal is trying to consume, so food sources, things that happen within their environment will cause reproductive success depending on the particular genotype of the organism itself. So whether the organism can survive within its environment. So some organisms blend in almost perfectly with their environment, and in that case, selective pressure will yield convergent traits. So any trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce more effectively than its peers is in a specific environment contributes to the process of natural selection. So, for example, coloring that makes beetles more likely to be eaten, or having a beak that is not well suited for local food sources, a lot like the finches we talked about, are examples of the opposite. These two examples are less likely to survive and reproduce. So in this image that I show you a giraffe. Basically, we have a short version of the giraffe, sort of a medium-sized version, and then a tall version. And as you can see, the environment yields the tall version surviving to reproduce because they're able to actually consume the food that they need to in order to survive. So this is surviving to reproduce, which is the most important part of natural selection and evolution as a whole. So now let's talk about selective pressure. So natural selection does not create camouflage alleles. Natural selection is not a process that chooses positive, quote unquote, traits. Natural selection doesn't create the alleles that are best for these animals. They happen naturally, and then because of their environment and the ability to survive, natural selection takes place naturally. So, natural selection strongly selects for camouflage alleles that arise by chance. So, like I said, they don't make these alleles happen. The process actually is natural. It happens by chance. These mutations happen within the genome, and then if they're a positive mutation, they survive to the next generation. So that's the process of natural selection. Each generation, the best camouflage individuals will survive to reproduce, and the alleles that confer or make that camouflage happen become more common in each generation. And natural selection works on the variation present in any population, because some individuals are actually better than others at surviving and reproducing, like we've been talking about. So in this image that I have here, we have a large bird who's the predator looking at the prey down here, which would be these little mice that we're looking at. So in this case, some mice are eaten by the birds. And as you can see, the background that the mice are living on, or their environment, is a dark gray color. Some of them are a light brown, and some of them mix with that dark gray and actually kind of camouflage themselves, which then in turn would hide them from this predator. So some of the mice are eaten. They happen to be these three in this example, are actually four light brown mice. And then these mice survive to reproduce in the next generation. And then we have less light brown mice because all of these dark colored mice are able to blend in with their environment, and that gene was passed down. So this is kind of the process of selective pressure in natural selection. But keep in mind, that also means that subsequent generations of this bird may evolve to better eyesight in order to see these mice, which then these mice would have to have another, selective pressure or natural selection to continue to survive. So it's really a circular process. It happens through predator, prey, just the life cycle itself. But this is the process. It's a good image to kind of show you how this works. So now let's talk about adaptations. So heritable traits, or traits that are inherited, that confer advantages or that create advantages, are adaptations. So traits that are passed down that make advantages for a species are called adaptations. These features provide a selective advantage because they improve an organism's ability, once again, to survive and reproduce. So these heritable traits that have advantages or adaptations, they help these organisms to survive and reproduce. So bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics have actually, they have an adaptive trait that is non-resistant bacteria lack. So when antibiotics are administered, selective pressure is applied for mutated resistant bacteria. This is just an example. So then antibiotics cannot create a resistance allele, and the variant must be present in the population, and use of the antibiotics causes frequency of the resistance allele to rise. For example, 40% of staph infection or staphylococcus infections are resistant to all antibiotics except for one. So basically, long story short, as an example of adaptation, certain bacterias like staphylococcus or staph infection have evolved, and they have gone through, they have adaptations in order to be resistant to antibiotics that are administered to try to kill the staph infection. So staph infection is a good example because it is actually resistant to nearly all antibiotics other than one. And eventually, it most likely will evolve to be also resistant to that one. In that case, we will have to come up with new antibiotic strains. So let's look at how antibiotic resistance actually occurs. So in circle 1 here, we have a high number of bacteria. A few of them are naturally resistant to antibiotics. Antibiotics kill the bacteria that it's meant to. So in this example, it's all these blue bacteria are killed. They kill the bacteria causing the illness, as well as good bacteria protecting the body from infection, because that's what antibiotics do. The resistant bacteria now have the preferred conditions to grow and take over. And so bacteria can even transfer their drug resistance to other bacteria within the body, causing even more problems. So basically, those antibiotics come in and do their job. They kill the bad bacteria. They also kill the good bacteria in the body. And any bacteria that was naturally resistant is actually able to then reproduce rapidly and also share its resistance with other bacteria in the body. So let's think about evolution in terms, this is my note. Let's think about evolution in terms of A's, C's, T's, and G's that cannot think or feel. So basically, natural selection happens as a chance thing. It doesn't happen by choice. It's not some overarching thing that is selecting positive traits. For example, in this bacteria antibiotic resistance example, we have naturally occurring resistant bacteria. And so those weren't chosen through the process of natural selection. They weren't chosen through the process of evolution. They naturally happened. And because of the processes within our body and the processes that antibiotics go through, it just by chance they're able to survive. So once again, evolution and natural selection, it doesn't think, it doesn't feel. It involves DNA and it involves basic biology. So as most of us probably know, evolution can be kind of a hot button topic for people, but we do have evidence of evolution that I'd like to kind of discuss with you. So one of those being the fossil record, another being anatomy and embryology, the third being biogeography, and the fourth being molecular biology. So this is actually a really interesting slide that students kind of like. So I'd like to kind of describe to you what homologous structures are. So this is kind of indicating the process of evolution because these structures are similar within different, completely different species, but they kind of follow the same track. So homologous structures, it says similar construction of these appendages indicate that these organisms actually may share a common ancestor. So that would be this image here. So these appendages being the arms. So we have a human arm here. And if you look at the image, it's actually kind of color-coded to show you across each species which bones form the same function. So here we have a human arm Here we have a cat's arm. We actually have a whale's fin here, which, as you should know, whales are mammals and also bats are mammals. So this is a bat's wing. So we have very similar structures. So at some point, there must have been a similar ancestor of a mammal, obviously millions and millions of years ago. But yes, so there's a human arm here, a cat arm, a whale fin, and a bat wing. So this would be something that, terrestrial, another terrestrial organism, a water organism, and then a flying organism. So all of these share, though, a common ancestor. So let's also talk about structures that are vestigial. So structures are vestigial when they have lost their apparent function. And I kind of talked about this previously. So for example, wings on flightless birds would be considered vestigial. Wings maybe on a penguin, for example. So then I have an image here of adult chickens, and mice and humans actually have very similar bodies, but their similarities are in their embryos. So for this example, I have a chicken embryo right here, and then I have a human embryo here. So believe it or not, chickens and human embryos both have slits that are homologous to fish gill slits, and they have small tails. So in the very beginning of life, within the chicken embryo and the human embryo, they actually share very similar physiological characteristics. So these are considered, once again, homologous structures. Basically, they're shared within different species and kind of indicate that in this case, there may be a shared ancestor, a common ancestor, and then this kind of gets more into the vestigial limb portion of the slide. So I'd like to talk more about some misconceptions about evolution, just slightly. So there's the misconception that individuals will evolve. So I keep kind of trying to reinforce the idea that populations involved, not individuals. So when I say populations, I mean, for example, the entire human population or the entire population of a specific bird, rather than one bird or one human. They don't evolve alone. It's, once again, by chance, different genes or alleles present themselves, and through the process of natural selection over years and years, they end up being more commonly found in the population itself rather than an individual. Another misconception is that evolution can explain the origin of life. That is not the case. The origin of life is technically still unknown. Evolution is a wonderful tool, but it cannot explain the origin of life. And the last misconception here is that organisms evolve on purpose. So like I said earlier, we have to think of evolution as it doesn't think, it doesn't feel. It's a process that happens by chance. Organisms don't evolve on purpose. Unfortunately, it's not something that organisms can do in order to survive, which is why we have species that are now extinct, whether that's from overpredation or hunting, environmental factors. So if these organisms had the choice to evolve, maybe they would have, but it wasn't something that was a choice. Their environment changed enough, or there was enough predation or hunting that they were killed off without choice. So these are some misconceptions involving the process of evolution. So the last slide that I have in this PowerPoint is about species. So I keep kind of mentioning the word species in this slideshow. I kind of want to talk about exactly what I'm talking about. So organisms have two word names. And if you've ever seen a scientific name, you'll know there's a genus and there's a species. So I have kind of an example of that here in this purple box. I have dogs, and their genus would be Canis, and their species would be C. familiaris. So if you ever look up genus and species of a dog, Canis familiaris would be what they're called in their scientific name. So a species is a group of individual organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. Species become isolated in a variety of ways. So, for example, the human species is a species that we are a group of individual organisms that can breed within each other and produce fertile offspring. Same thing with birds, same thing with fish. There are certain species of birds, certain species of fish, certain species of, obviously, dogs are a species. So, basically, it's any group that has individual organisms that can reproduce fertile offsprings. We talked about species becoming isolated when we talked about Darwin and his book about the finches in the Galapagos. So basically, speciation is based on geography and is allopatric. So due to a physical barrier preventing reproduction, This is the process that's making it allopatric. So an example here is Mexican and northern spotted owls. So basically speciation based on geography is what we call allopatric. Due to a physical barrier preventing reproduction. So, for example, the finches that Darwin saw in the Galapagos were physically barriered by way too much ocean to get back to the mainland, so they weren't able to reproduce with the species on the mainland. There's a physical barrier preventing that. And once again, there are spotted owls in Mexico and in the north, closer to Canada, and those owls are not breeding with one another. So that's speciation. Those species are separated by geography, so it's an allopatric process. So speciation occurs in a shared habitat, and that can also be called sympatric. So once again, if we have speciation or difference in species based on geography, it's called allopatric. If we have speciation occurring in a shared habitat, so a habitat that's the same and they're not separated by geography, it's called sympatric. This would be due to chromosomes, commonly in polyploidy species. So this commonly happens in plants. So here I have kind of a physical, an image here that's an example to show you what I'm talking about. So in this case, we're talking about these trees. So on the left here, we have an allopatric speciation. So this is geographical isolation. This is what happened with the Galapagos finches and the mainland finches in Darwin's example. So basically, there is a physical geographical barrier that is preventing these two types of trees from cross-pollinating or from mating with each other. So this is a geographical isolation. It's called allopatric speciation. So on this side, we have what we call sympatric speciation. This is reproductive isolation. Basically, these are chromosomal differences that are not allowing these two types of trees to cross-pollinate or breed with one another. So this is within themselves. This is not something that's being geographically done or separating them in that way. This is happening because these two types of trees are different enough that they can't breed with one another, so they aren't the same species. So this commonly happens, once again, in plants. Okay, so now we've made it to the last slide of this show. So this is the key takeaways. There are 3 of them. So first, I'd like you to understand that evolution is a change in allele frequency in a population. Selective pressure can be convergent or divergent, and natural selection is the result of reproductive success. The second is that individuals cannot evolve, only populations do. Evolution does not involve the origin of life. It can't explain the origin of life. Evolution involves A's, T's, G's, and C's. And basically that means it involves DNA. Evolution cannot create, it cannot think, and it cannot feel. So it involves chances that happen naturally, mutations within organisms, whether they are favored or not, in order to create a better environment for the individual itself, so whether or not they're able to reproduce. So evolution cannot think, it cannot feel. It's a natural process that happens by chance. And then third, I have that speciation involves a barrier to reproduction that is either chromosomal or geographical. So it can be based on habitat location or chromosome. So those are the key takeaways for this slideshow. If you have any questions, follow up with me, but otherwise you guys are free to move on. Thank you.